In this video, I will briefly describe the basics of doing enterprise architecture. There we go. Here are the top 4 frameworks in current practice. On the upper left is DODAF, on the upper right is FIAF, on the lower left is TOGAF, and on the lower right is the Zachman Enterprise Architecture Framework. Are there concepts in common between these, or do you have to learn each one? Well, generally when you get certified in one of these, and then you are left to learn the others, and the concepts that drive the whole thing are left out. But there are common concepts. The first one to learn is model versus representation. In enterprise architecture, you can view it in 2 different ways. There's the model, which is the data that's stored and managed, and the representation, the artifacts that you produce. So when you deliver in architecture, you deliver a set of artifacts. But when you exchange in architecture, you exchange the data. The 4 kinds of artifacts are lists. TOGAF calls them catalogs, which are essentially Excel spreadsheets. The second is matrices, which describe the relationship between one catalog or list expressed across the top and another one down the side, and in the cells in the intersection you describe the relationship between the 2. Then there are drawings, which have many standards. I'll show you some at the end, and you do those in Visio or Archie or any of the many enterprise architecture tools. And then documents, and these usually have templates. TOGAF says that documents are not a kind of artifact, but here they generally are. Certainly you include them in your architecture when you deliver quite often. So to my mind, anything that you deliver in your enterprise architecture becomes an artifact. There are groupings of artifacts, and IEEE ISO have identified viewpoints and views as being critical to in architecture, a critical kind of thing that must be defined. There are also domains, which we'll go over, which divide architecture into different things like the data architecture and the business architecture. And then there are perspectives, which are used along the side of a Zachman like matrix in SABSA or in Zachman. And these 3 things are essentially interchangeable, but not exactly. They're parallel constructs, parallel concepts, but they are not identical. Instead, the viewpoints and views, which have the backing of the international standards, group architectures in some of these frameworks, and in others you use domains, and in others you use perspectives, and they're framework dependent. So think of these as roughly equivalent concepts. On the right you have the DODAF viewpoints, and viewpoints will be in abstract, views will be in specific. So if you have pieces of paper in your hand, they are views, and if you have the concept in your mind, it's a viewpoint. On the left you find the TOGAF equivalent of that. So we can divide our artifacts into groups in these categories. Now we pick and choose among artifacts. Here are the some of the artifacts on the left for DODAF 2.0, and on the right we have TOGAF. You just pick which artifacts are useful for your particular architecture and then use them. There are 4 kinds of data: the components, that is the blocks on a diagram, the relationships, the lines between the blocks, and those correspond to lists and matrices, the principles on through which the architecture was developed or will be evolved, and last, the context. And the context, you can look at that either bottom up or top down. The context can be taken as either your architecture has subordinate architectures, and that implements context in the tree from top to bottom, or the context may be taken as stated in ISO, which is that each architecture has a parent. So, it may not be described, it may not have an explicit architecture, you're just going to describe the context, but it could be an architecture, you could describe it. So there's a hierarchy of architectures, potentially, and at some point someone will not have described it, and the ones underneath are either described or not. Putting data first. Well, I'm trying to show you here that interrogatives versus perspectives gives us 36 buckets of data. And the perspectives are like the viewpoints, as I said, and across the top we have the interrogatives. That's who, what, where, when, how, and why. So if you build those 36 buckets and divide your architecture data into them, you have a mechanism to manage the data you are using in your architecture, and you have some idea that that set of data will be complete, comprehensive. You can have too much data. There's the most common failure mode for enterprise architecture is boiling the ocean, producing an architecture of too much scope, so it never gets done, and it's not really understandable. Most enterprise architectures have failed for boiling the ocean. This is, by the way, SABSA and the SABSA model of data. And here is DM2 from DODAF. This is a model of the data underlying architecture. It was used as an exchange mechanism, or was intended to be used as an exchange mechanism. Unfortunately, it failed to do that. Nobody really uses DM2 as an exchange mechanism between different architecture tools to produce architectures in different frameworks, or even in the same framework in a new tool. But it's quite comprehensive, as you see. Glossaries and semantic reference models. This is another thing in your data. Some believe that an enterprise architecture is only a semantic model of all the terms. Uaf has these semantic reference models, or the different reference models, and the reference models then act as a glossary, an organized glossary. DODAF has just a glossary and doesn't have this hierarchy or division of the different kinds of things, taxonomies of how to describe which thing you have in hand. Some people stop after the reference models are completed in Uaf and say that they are done, but there's a common approach document which describes the artifacts in addition for Uaf. Scopes are levels. In 2007, Burke identified the 3 levels of enterprise architecture in the Uaf practice guidance. There's the enterprise architecture, the segment architecture, and the solution architecture. Now, the biggest problem with this is that what he said is that the enterprise architecture consists of 3 things, and the first is the enterprise architecture, which is very confusing. If enterprise architecture is defined as all 3, it can't be defined as just one. So it confused people and caused misuse of the term. So many of us change the name of enterprise architecture on this kind of drawing and call it executive architecture. Then we can say that the enterprise architecture consists of the executive architecture, the segment architecture, and the solution architecture. Now we call it executive architecture because it has a low level of detail, as you can see, and it covers the entire organization. It's the most strategic and has the most impact. At the bottom you have the solution architecture, which is very narrow and very deep. In the middle is the segment, which has a moderate breadth and moderate depth. So it can become the largest of the three. If you multiply 1, 2, and 3 times 1, 2, and 3, you'll get the idea. 2 times 2 is 4, and that's the biggest number you get out of that. Kinds of architectures. We have 7 kinds of architectures. First is the aforementioned executive architecture, which supports portfolio management or transformation. It tells the executives how to transform the enterprise in order to meet their goals. A segment architecture instead tells you how to improve the performance of some particular line of business, some service line or product line. And solution architecture tells you how to, specifies how to build a solution or maintain it. So these correspond roughly to the 3 levels of management in the PMI set of management practices. So you have portfolio management, program management, and project management. Now then, a thing that's common in DoD is the reference architecture, which is an example of a particular thing, but not a specific instance. Now it may be any of the 3, but is most commonly an example of a solution, a generic example, which you will then take and change for your particular implementation. A domain architecture uses that older notion of a domain. A domain is a subdivision of the enterprise architecture. The common ones are the business architecture, the data architecture, the infrastructure architecture, the application architecture, the security architecture. You might also produce a performance architecture, but these domains attempt to describe top to bottom that portion of the executive architecture so that the combined set of domains is the enterprise, the executive architecture is the enterprise architecture. Now the problem with this is that domains can become huge and they don't have a specific purpose other than dividing up the enterprise architecture into manageable pieces. A spot architecture, on the other hand, uses some grouping of data, such as the domain architecture, and focuses on one management problem and produces, say, decision support on that one problem. A meta-architecture tells us how we will do architecture and is useful in managing the architecture practice. Now, maturity management uses that meta-architecture. You start off at the lowest levels of maturity by grabbing a framework off the shelf and saying, this is how we do architecture. And then you tailor it more and more to become more specific and more produce exactly what you need in the organization out of your enterprise architecture practice. You have to tie this all together with some sort of architecture governance in a large organization. If you have multiple parties, multiple contractors perhaps doing multiple architectures, then you might need an executive oversight board to describe to this large effort what you need out of architecture, what the executives want out of their architecture. Then there's the Enterprise Architecture Review Board, which will review either the segments or the domains. And then the Architecture Review Board, which will review the individual solutions. And there might be a few of these in a large organization. Then there's the Customer Review and the Peer Review. So if you have all 5 of these elements, you have an architecture governance practice. And again, they should all be described as to how they work and how they fit together in your meta-architecture. So to start an enterprise architecture practice, you decide on how you're going to do enterprise architecture, and you might divide this into the 5 activities. And this is my one big contribution to the whole range of enterprise architecture, just noting that there are 5 activities. So you need an executive architecture capability, you need a segment architecture capability, or domain architecture capability if you wish, a solution architecture capability. That's your first 3. Then you need governance to tie it all together, and then you need a maturity management and self-improvement capability, and those last 2 become portions of your architecture management. The large portion of it. There's a few other things, such as outreach and promotion. And then all of this will be described in your meta-architecture. And if you write it down, then it will be possible for anyone new trying to contribute to understand how it all works and where they fit. If you don't write it down, then you get to wing it, and your architecture is less mature. Once you write it down, you have become more mature. Once you then improve that meta-architecture, you go back and say, oh, well, last year's isn't as good as what we're going to do this year, so let's change it this way. Then your maturity improves again. The maturity management process, or tailoring, is changes to the meta-architecture. Here's some example drawing formats and processes. Here's IDEF 0, which was once how you defined processes, but it was really never for that. It does something more like define capabilities. In IDEF 0, you're supposed to use an 8.5 by 11 page, and you're not supposed to have more than 6 items on a page. Look at this. It's so clear. It makes everything clear, what the outputs are, what the inputs are. It uses something called ICOM, where the controls go in the top, the outputs go out the right, the inputs come in the left. And in the ICOM model, you then get a pretty complete understanding of how each one of these activities or capabilities works. I don't think it's ever really been replaced in terms of being able to define things like a capability. Here's BPMN, which replaced it for the purpose of defining business process. And this, you can see, is much more complex. It has many more elements and lots more symbols. In practice, almost no analysts use every kind of symbol on this chart. There are just too many. So it's a great success in some sense, but it's not a success, and it's too much. It's over complex. The idea was that you were going to produce workflow engines, and you could use this directly to drive your workflow engine, and it would automate the work for you, but that never worked either. DODAF templates. Here's an example DODAF template for an SV1, the basic view of a system and how they are interconnected. And here we see round things which are nodes, and systems are inside them. And DODAF generally produces command and control. So here we have a command and control kind of system being described. It's not a cloud type thing, but it could be. You could have a virtual presence. You use virtual presence from each one of these locations and describe how you're talking between the nodes. It would be perfectly fine. So the DODAF SV1 can be adopted or adapted to whatever circumstance you have and can describe the relationship between systems. Here's an SV6 which identifies the specifics of the interfaces, the data exchanges between every system and every other system in your system of systems. Here's the Uaf Catalog. Uaf was designed to unify both DODAF and MODAF and several others together. And so they came up with a complex catalog of kinds of things Now, these kinds of things are artifacts, and there's a fairly large number. In DODAF, there are 50, so this has grown over time. Processes. On the left, you see the ADM, or Architecture Development Methodology of TOGAF, which started out as the Application Development Methodology in a DoD mechanism. On the right, you see the present DoD mechanism, DODAF 2.0, and the 6-step method, which works quite well, but doesn't cover the whole cycle. Here's on top and in back is the collaborative planning method designed for implementing segment architectures. So what you have learned. You've learned about the 4 major EA frameworks, the 4 types of artifacts, views, domains, and perspectives, and how they're roughly the same concept. The menu of artifacts and choosing different artifacts to fit your purpose. The 4 kinds of data. The interrogatives, perspectives, and Zachman-like matrices to organize data. The problem of boiling the ocean, the most common problem in enterprise architecture that we try to manage by having different types of architectures. You've learned about glossaries and semantic reference models. You've learned about DM2 data exchange, and that never took off. You've learned about the scopes or levels of architecture in FIAF and TOGAF and etc. You've learned about the 7 kinds of architectures. You learned about maturity management, architecture governance, the architecture practice, and you've seen some examples of artifacts. Thank you so very much for your time. I hope this helps.